Georgia Tech, number 3, Dennis Scott.
Today we look at the Magic career of Dennis Scott. Scott was a college basketball star for Georgia Tech in the late 1980s, and after 3 seasons he led the Yellow Jackets to the Final Four in the 1990 NCAA tournament. After the season, Scott decided to forego his senior year at Georgia Tech and declared for the NBA draft. Orlando had the 4th pick in the 1990 NBA draft and wanted Scott. New Jersey, Seattle, and Denver would pick before Orlando, and as the draft drew closer, both the Nets and Sonics floated rumors that they might select the ACC Player of the Year. The Magic, worried that their man might be off the board when their selection came, sent 2 second-round picks to the Sonics, who then forwarded a second-round pick to the Nets to ensure those teams would pass on Scott. The Nets went on to select future Rookie of the Year Derek Coleman, the Sonics selected future Hall of Famer Gary Payton, and the Magic took Dennis Scott. Scott got off to a shaky start in his rookie season. Coming off the bench behind Jerry Reynolds in his first 3 games, Scott averaged just 3 points per game in an average of 20 minutes, while shooting only 17% from the field and 25% from downtown as the Magic went 0 for 3. When coach Matt Guokas told Scott prior to his 4th NBA game that he would be starting, he was shocked, but he stepped in to deliver the instant offense that the Magic envisioned when they selected him, pouring in 28 points in 37 minutes, but the Magic lost again. After the Magic finally won their first game of the season, the following game, Scott played just 3 minutes before Reynolds and Otis Smith combined to hit 14 of 18 shots and lead the Magic to another win, while Scott watched on from the bench. Reynolds started the next 6 games, but the Magic lost 5 of them and the season was starting to slip away. Scott got another chance to start again in the last game in November, and he set a new team record at the time, landing 6 3-pointers as he put up 24 points, and Guokas had seen enough. Scott started at small forward for the remainder of the season. Month by month, Scott steadily increased his scoring average as he got into a playing rhythm, raising his November average from 10 points per game to 15 in December, 16 in January, maintained his 16-point average in February despite playing through a toe issue, and increased his average to 19 by March as he dropped a career-high 40 points on the Nuggets, being named the NBA's Player of the Week and the league's Rookie of the Month. Scott, as a rookie, was leading the league in 3-pointers made, and he was invited to participate in the NBA's 3-point shooting contest at the All-Star Weekend. Scott performed well, hitting 9 straight shots in the first round and 16 points overall to progress to the semi-finals. In the semi-finals, Scott missed all 5 money balls, scoring 12 points but finished the competition in 3rd place. Scott was an offensive-minded player, launching a franchise record 33 shots in one game against the 76ers, but Guokas often took him out of games when he was being scored on at the defensive end. Scott landed 125 3-point makes in the 1990-91 season, more than any other rookie in NBA history at the time, and he was named to the NBA's All-Rookie First Team, and he finished 3rd in Rookie of the Year voting. After finishing with a promising 31-51 record the previous season, the Magic got off to a solid start in the 1991-92 campaign, winning 5 of their first 8 games, with Scott averaging over 22 points per game in November. As the calendar turned to December, Scott sat out games with what was diagnosed as a sore right leg, and the Magic went on a losing streak. In mid-December, Scott tried to return to the team, playing 3 games off the bench, but inflammation in his right leg made it painful to jump. Scott's injury was not thought to be very serious, and he was continually re-evaluated, but dates to return to the lineup continued to be pushed back as his injury refused to heal. Finally in March, with the team sporting a 15-49 record, coach Matt Guokas confirmed that Scott would not return this season. Scott had played only 18 games, averaging 19.9 points per game, but the Magic limped to an injury-riddled 21-61 record, and in the off-season Scott had 2 surgeries, one for ITB friction syndrome and a second surgery on his knee. The Magic landed the number 1 pick in the draft and used it to select Shaquille O'Neal. Scott immediately took O'Neal under his wing, and the two quickly bonded. Shaq would later say that Scott taught him how to be a professional. Once again, Scott and the Magic started the season strongly with an 8-3 record in November behind Scott's 20-point per game average. In December, Scott maintained his 20-point per game average while shooting almost 50% from downtown. Scott shined with a 38-point night against the Pistons, where he broke his own franchise record for three-pointers, landing 8. Scott's play began to cool in January, and after 4 games he tore his calf muscle in practice. He attempted to make a comeback in early February, but the calf was still bothering him, and after 3 bench games with limited minutes, Scott went back to the injured list. Scott eased back into the lineup in March, and in his 3rd game back he scored 24 points off the bench, earning a return to the starting lineup. Unfortunately, the following night at Milwaukee, Scott only played 6 minutes after injuring his Achilles tendon in the first quarter, and would miss another 2 weeks. Once healed, once again Scott eased back into the lineup, and after consecutive 20-point games he was inserted back into the starting lineup for the April playoff push. Scott averaged 15 points a game in April, including a new career high of 41 points against the Bucks, where he once again raised his franchise record for 3-point makes in a game to 9, but ultimately the Magic missed the playoffs on a tiebreaker. With the playoff miss, the Magic incredibly won the number 1 draft pick for the 2nd consecutive year, and on the surface you may not think drafting Anthony Hardaway would have much impact on Scott's career, but you would be wrong. The new season also brought a coaching change, and new coach Brian Hill wanted Scott Skiles to remain the starting point guard and mentor Hardaway, but Penny was too talented to come off the bench. So Hardaway started at shooting guard, Nick Anderson was seen as the better all-around player over Scott's long-range shooting, and so he started at small forward, meaning Scott began the 1993-94 season as the Magic's 6th man. Scott had been averaging almost 15 shot attempts a game for his career thus far, but with Shaq, Penny and Nick as the team's top 3 options, Scott's field goal attempts dropped to 9 per game in his bench role. Scott approached his role with enthusiasm, seeing himself as a towel-waving morale booster when he wasn't on the floor, while trying to improve his all-around game, driving to the hoop more often and trying to improve his rebounding. As the Magic approached the All-Star weekend, Scott was averaging career lows of 21 minutes and only 9.7 points per game. He endured jokes about his weight and trade rumors involving the Los Angeles Clippers, but the Magic had a 26-19 record. The Magic began to play strongest with a lineup that included Scott at small forward, Anderson at shooting guard, and Hardaway at the point, and 2 games before the All-Star game, with some speculation that he was being showcased before the trade deadline, Brian Hill made a lineup change. The first game with Scott back in the starting lineup was a disaster. He scored just 7 points as the Magic were blown out by the Knicks, but they won the next 7 straight games, and Scott averaged over 18 points per game during the run to cement his spot in the starting 5 and quash any thoughts of a trade. During early March, Scott learned about the death of his father. Originally confused with another death which was a suicide, Scott learned his father, Dennis Scott Sr., died of a heroin overdose after years working as a drug counselor. Scott's play was affected, but he missed no games despite the loss and attended his father's funeral. Scott got back on track in the playoff run, averaging almost 18 points a game in the final 20 outings, of which the Magic won 13 to roll into the playoffs with a franchise-best 50-32 record. The Magic faced an experienced Indiana team in the playoffs, and Scott had a solid series, averaging 14 points per game as a starter, but Reggie Miller led the Pacers to a 3-game sweep, sending the Magic back to the drawing board. After the season, Scott had only 1 year remaining on his contract. The trade rumours had been regular, and Scott wanted to renegotiate a contract extension. The Magic elected to wait and have Scott play out the final season of his contract, and the season did not begin well, with a back injury during training camp lingering through pre-season and into November, missing the first 12 games of the season. Scott came back out of shape, and Coach Hill had settled on Donald Royal as the starting small forward. Royal was a dependable defender who had backed up Scott during the previous 2 seasons, but Hill liked his game and Scott was left out of the 8-man rotation once he was healthy. After a few games with cameo appearances off the bench, Scott worked his way into the rotation in mid-December, and his minutes increased month by month as he played himself into shape. When Scott was on, he racked up points quickly, often having games where his point total was higher than his minutes played, scoring a team record 20 points in a quarter against the Bucks, with 15 of those coming in a 4-minute span. In late February, Royal sprained his ankle against the Bulls, and Scott was moved into the starting lineup. Scott averaged 18 points a game in the next 6 outings, with the Magic winning 5 of them. But then as Royal returned from injury, Scott hit a mini slump, shooting under 30% from the floor in the next 4 games, 3 of which the Magic lost, and Royal was moved back into the starting lineup for the rest of the regular season. Scott was unfazed. With 3 games of 30 or more points off the bench, he averaged nearly 17 points per game in April, finishing 5th in the NBA's 6th Man of the Year voting as the Magic entered the postseason with a franchise-best 57-25 record. In the first round against Boston, Scott averaged 13.5 points per game off the bench, with the Magic taking a 3-1 series win. In the second round against Chicago, the teams split the first two games of the series. Royal had been struggling since the opening game of the playoffs, and Hill decided to put Scott into the starting lineup for Game 3. The Magic won Game 3, and Scott scored over 20 points in the final three games as Orlando took a 4-2 series win. Scott stayed hot against the Pacers in the Eastern Conference Finals, averaging 20 points for the first four games of the series, before hitting 5 of 7 three-pointers for 19 points in the Game 7 victory. Scott struggled in the NBA Finals, stating he didn't know if he had ever shot this bad. Defenders Mario Elie and Robert Horry for the Rockets proved effective in making Scott misfire, as he shot just 31% for the series, averaging just 10.5 points per game as the Magic was swept and the Houston Rockets took the NBA championship. In 1995, Scott entered free agency, but he ultimately re-signed with the Magic for the 3-year, $9 million contract prior to the 95-96 season. And after Scott's strong playoff run in 1995, the Magic's starting lineup was set. There was just one problem. In a preseason game against Miami, Shaq was fouled hard by Matt Geiger, breaking his thumb and requiring surgery. With Shaq out of the lineup, Scott's scoring was needed more than normal, and he came out firing with 27 points on opening night, and he averaged over 20 points per game in November as the Anthony Hardaway-led Magic shot out to a 13-2 record. Scott was shooting 44% from downtown, even without Shaq drawing the defense inside, and he kept his scoring average over 20 points per game for the 22 games that Shaq missed to start the season. Scott contributed in other ways too, averaging career highs in rebounds, assists and steals to try and help the Magic to cover for the loss of Shaq. When O'Neal returned, Scott's numbers took only a slight drop, even after a Horace Grant injury saw Scott starting at power forward for a time. Scott used his quickness to his advantage against bigger forwards, giving Milwaukee's Vin Baker fits on the perimeter as he lit up the Bucks for 37 points. Against the Suns, Scott put up 16 points and added a career-high 11 rebounds and 7 assists. Against the 76ers, he scored 19 points and blocked a career-high 5 shots, and he entered the All-Star break on a team record streak of 52 consecutive games with at least one three-pointer made. Scott was again invited to participate in the NBA's three-point contest as part of All-Star Weekend. In the first round, Scott got on a late streak of 8 shots in a row to score 19 points and move on to the semi-finals. In the semis, Scott scored 19 points again to move on to the final against Tim Legler, but Scott started out cold in the final and he only finished with 14 points to finish as the runner-up. Shortly after the All-Star break, Scott had 3 games with 8 three-point makes, and he started to think about breaking the NBA record of 10 makes in a game, held by 3 players, one of whom was current teammate Brian Shaw, who set the record when playing for Miami. In March, though, Scott went into a minor shooting slump. His field goal percentage dropped to 40%, and his scoring average dropped to 13.5. But against the Pistons, with 15 games remaining in the season, Scott broke the NBA record for most three-pointers in a season as he hit his 218th long-range shot. Scott continued to rack up the 3 balls, but on April 7th against Chicago, he went 0 for 5 from downtown, ending his streak of games with at least one three-pointer at 78. 12 days later, Scott finally got that single-game three-point record that he had been chasing. In a game against the Hawks, Scott scored 35 points, including a record 11 three-pointers, and ironically, he was assisted by previous record holder Brian Shaw on the record-breaking shot. Shaw said it's a crazy feeling knowing that you have the record and he's trying to get it. But I'm not a selfish person. He was open and he was feeling it, so I passed it to him. I know what the feeling is like from when I did it 3 years ago. I'm happy for him.
Now the Magic run a transition break. Bijan finds Dennis Scott. He stops. He pops. He's got the record. He's got the record. Dennis Scott makes NBA history. And listen to this crowd as Dennis Scott gets the standing ovation. He has wanted this.
The Magic set a franchise record with 60 wins, and Scott had had the best season of his career. Starting in all 82 games, he tallied a career-high 1,431 points at a 17.5 per game average, and with a total of 267 three-pointers made, he set an NBA record mark that would stand for 10 years. In the first round of the playoffs, the Magic swept the Pistons, with Scott shooting over 57% from downtown as he averaged 18.3 points per game. The Magic beat the Hawks 4-1 in the second round, but Scott was held to just 10 points per game in the series due to the strong defensive play of Stacey Augmon. This led to a showdown with the 72-10 Chicago Bulls in the Eastern Conference Finals, a team whom Scott had struggled against all season, and once the Bulls' long defenders shut Scott down on the perimeter, he averaged only 7 points per game in the series and the Magic lost 4-0. In the off-season of 1996, Shaquille O'Neal left the Magic in free agency, but Scott welcomed a return to the motion offense where he had thrived the season before while O'Neal was injured. Leading into opening night, Scott strained his hamstring, and he would miss the first 6 games of the season. Scott tried to ease his way back in late November, but re-aggravated the injury and missed an additional 8 games. Penny Hardaway had also gone down with knee issues, and the Magic were poised at 8-8 after 16 games. Penny and Scott both returned to help the team beat the Blazers, but Penny's return lasted just 1 game, and Nick Anderson went down injured as well. Scott did his best to help keep the Magic afloat, averaging 16.9 points per game in December, but the Magic lost 8 of 9 games to finish the month 10-16. January saw a healthier team, more wins, and a more balanced attack, but without Shaq to draw the defense, Scott was shooting under 40% from the field for the first time in his career, which included an 0-for-10 night against the Bullets. After a 5-game winning streak, the Magic entered the All-Star break 24-20, but then lost 5 straight games afterward, which led to a players-only meeting and coach Brian Hill was fired. Under interim coach Richie Adubato, Scott's field goal attempts dropped by around 3 per game, but he shot a more efficient percentage and the team reeled off 6 straight wins. They won 16 of their next 20. At the beginning of April, Scott injured his knee and he tried playing through it, but he missed 2 games and he played sparingly in a pair of others as the team limped to the playoffs, losing 8 of its final 13 games. The Magic played Florida rivals Miami in the first round of the playoffs, and Scott's knee issue was still troubling him. After an ineffective Game 1 where he scored only 5 points, Scott barely played and he went scoreless in Games 2 and 3. Scott scored 8 points to help push the series to a deciding 5th game, but the Magic went down 3-2 with Scott scoring just 2 points in the season finale. During the off-season, Scott trimmed down, but he began to hear whispers in the media that his weight loss was related to drug use. Scott had become unhappy with his contract and his treatment by the Magic organization. During 1996-97, he was the lowest paid starter on the Magic, with bench player Brian Shaw also being paid more than Scott. Unhappy with the 1 year and $3 million remaining on his contract, Scott threatened to sit out the entirety of next season if his contract wasn't restructured. These issues came to a head at a summer basketball camp in Virginia, where during a speech to children attending his camp, Scott played rap music with explicit lyrics while going on a tirade towards the Magic and the media. The camp was cancelled, refunds were issued, and 2 months later, Scott was traded to the Dallas Mavericks for Derek Harper and Ed O'Bannon. Scott played well in Dallas, but he was traded mid-season, and he bounced around the league with stops in Phoenix, New York, Minnesota, and Vancouver. Scott was traded by Vancouver to Washington, but he was waived during training camp. An attempted comeback with the Los Angeles Lakers the following season fell short, and Scott retired. In Scott's 446-game Orlando Magic career, he averaged 14.8 points per game, and he landed on a team record total of 981 three-pointers. I hope you have enjoyed this look at the Magic career of Dennis Scott. This concludes our look at the Magic players who began their career with the franchise during the 1990-91 season. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and check back soon for our next episode, a look at the Magic career of Stephen Thompson.